In my paper titled Thick Atmosphere as a Thermal Reservoir, I point out that there are two primary sources for the argument that CO2 drives temperature. Both of them are wrong. One is that temperatures have gone up since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, implying that the exhaust of industry is the cause of the increased warming. The other is that Earth would be frozen if it weren't for CO2 and water vapor warming up our planet above the effective temperature calculated for an airless body in space. The first claim is a red herring, a false lead. Earth was already scheduled for regular warming, and that warming started before the Industrial Revolution. Remember, climate always changes, warming and cooling in overlapping cycles. And don't forget, we currently live in an ice age interglacial, part of the Pleistocene Ice Age. What ended 12,000 years ago was merely the most recent glacial period of the current ice age. The second claim is also a false lead. Earth would be warmer than the effective temperature even if the atmosphere were pure nitrogen.
Let's revisit Al Gore's infamous film of inconvenient lies and half-truths. In that film, he showed a huge graph comparing CO2 levels and temperature over the last 650,000 years.
Now, an important point. In all of this time, 650,000 years, the CO2 level has never gone above 300 parts per million. Now, as I said, they can also measure temperature. Here's what the temperature has been on our Earth. Now, one thing that kind of jumps out at you is, well, let me put it this way. If my classmate from the 6th grade that talked about Africa and South America were here, he would say, did they ever fit together? Most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. But they did, of course. And the relationship is actually very complicated, but there is one relationship that is far more powerful than all the others, and it is this. When there is more carbon dioxide, the temperature gets warmer because it traps more heat from the sun inside.
Notice how Gore implies that CO2 drives the increased warming despite the fact that there was no heavy industry or cars 600,000 years ago. Notice what he says next.
Carbon dioxide, having never gone above 300 parts per million, here is where CO2 is now. Way above where it's ever been as far back as this record will measure. Now, if you'll bear with me, I want to really emphasize this point. The crew here has tried to teach me how to use this contraption here, so if I don't kill myself, I'll... It's already right here. Look how far above the natural cycle this is, and we've done that. But ladies and gentlemen, in the next 50 years, really in less than 50 years, it's going to continue to go up. When some of these children who are here are my age, here's what it's going to be in less than 50 years. You've heard of off the charts. Within less than 50 years, it'll be here. There's not a single fact or date or number that's been used to make this up that's in any controversy. The so-called skeptics look at this and they say, so? That seems perfectly okay. Well...
Here is where the CO2 level is today, some 18 years later. And the average global temperature is still somewhere around the same place, only 0.8 degrees warmer, instead of the projected 17 degrees.
Remember, climate always changes in overlapping cycles. Here's another set of facts everyone seems to be missing. One of those cycles is roughly 1,000 years long. From that cycle, the Holocene has enjoyed 10 distinct major warm periods, the most recent of which are the current modern, the medieval, the Roman, and the Minoan warm periods. In the midst of the Little Ice Age, the modern warm period started right on schedule. Sometime between now and the next century, the modern will reach its peak if we can use the past as our guide. But so far it is the coldest of the 10 major warm periods, and it has been slowing down for the last quarter century. How much of this warm period was from causes already scheduled by nature? In favor of nature is the fact that the modern is the coldest major warm period of the Holocene. CO2 could not keep the modern out of last place. The more you attribute to humans CO2, the weaker you make the major warm period already scheduled by nature. While it is entirely possible that nature simply took a vacation, that is not likely. And when you look at the modified form of Gore's graph, you realize that CO2 is really pretty wimpy.
The greenhouse hypothesis tells us that CO2 traps infrared light so that Earth warms up. But light travels at nearly 200,000 miles per second. That's pretty fast. Desert sands warm up within a few hours until they are too hot to walk on barefooted.
Why would it take decades or centuries to catch up to the monstrous increase in CO2? It shouldn't. Every day, the lower atmosphere warms up because of sunlight hitting the ground. It only takes minutes to hours for that daily warming to occur. And it only takes 1,000th of a second to bounce off the surface and to hit the greenhouse gases. If CO2 were trapping the heat, as implied by Gore's graph, then we should see temperatures skyrocketing, but they aren't. If CO2 actually did what Gore implied, then we should already have seen plus 17 degrees of warming. But we didn't. In a more recent study on the thermal capacity of equivalent layers of 7 worlds with thick atmospheres, I discovered that the vertical temperature profile of these 7 solar system worlds, Venus, Earth, Jupiter, Saturn, Titan, Uranus, and Neptune, relies solely on 4 key factors. 1. Insolation, the amount of sunlight received. 2. Albedo, the amount reflected away. 3. Specific heat of the constituent gases, in other words, their ability to store heat energy. And 4. The mass of the equivalent atmospheric column. The absorption and emission spectra for these gases was nowhere to be found as a contributing factor for each of these 7 worlds. In other words, the greenhouse hypothesis was effectively falsified. Let's dig a little more deeply here.
When sunlight hits the ground, much of it is absorbed by that surface and converted into heat energy. Some of that heat energy warms the adjacent air by conduction. And because hot air rises, that warmer air distributes the heat to the rest of the troposphere through convection. So far, no greenhouse effect involved.
Let us imagine an atmosphere which consists entirely of nitrogen. That stored heat energy will not be distributed evenly throughout the troposphere. This is because gravity squeezes most of the air toward the surface, and with it, squeezes most of the thermal energy closer to the surface too. If we were to double our hypothetical nitrogen atmosphere, we would automatically increase the warming effect at the surface because far more stored heat would be squeezed toward the surface. You can't add another entire Earth's atmosphere and expect all that gas to remain at super cold, absolute zero. All of that air will reach a new equilibrium with a greater quantity of stored thermal energy. And this is why, deep within the bowels of Jupiter, the temperature is scalding hot despite the near cryogenic temperatures at cloud level. And this is why the surface of Venus is scorching hot despite the high reflectivity of our sister planet. But what about the CO2 on Venus, you might ask? The more recent thermal capacity studies showed that the pressure equivalent atmospheric layer, or peel for Venus, was just the same as the peel for every one of the other worlds with thick atmospheres. Those 6 other worlds have greenhouse gases in the 1 to 3% range, while Venus has 96.5% CO2. And yet there was almost no difference in the thermal energy held in their pressure-equivalent atmospheric layers. Virtually no difference. The only detectable factors affecting the peel of our 7 solar system worlds with thick atmospheres are insolation, albedo, specific heat, and atmospheric mass. Gore had debunked himself in his own film. These additional facts only nail the coffin shut on climate change hysteria.